This is Mises Weekends with your host, Jeff Deist.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us once again on Mises Weekends. I'm very pleased to have as our guest today John Williams, who is the proprietor and founder of a very important and a great website called shadowstats.com. It's a site that I've been familiar with since a long time ago, back in my days working for Ron Paul. We used to use John's information and data in some of Dr. Paul's speeches and statements. John holds a couple of degrees from Dartmouth College, and he worked for many years in the private sector for Fortune 500 companies as a consultant and economist for them. But as I mentioned, he now runs shadowstats.com. And if you're not reading it and you're not familiar with him, I think you would do yourself a great favor by reading the site and becoming familiar with him. So with that, John, thanks so much for joining us today.
Jeff, thank you so much for having me.
Well, let me ask you kind of a tongue-in-cheek question before we get into the meat of things. We've been hearing a lot lately about fake news. That seems to be the story of the day. And it struck me when I was looking at your site earlier today. Should we be thinking of government-issued statistics like CPI and GDP as fake, at least in a certain sense of the word?
Absolutely. What you'll see here is that the problems are, in most instances, definitional, where the methodologies have been changed over the years, but the methodologies that have been changed have generally been counterintuitive to what most people expect in the numbers, so that you end up with the headline economic details overstating economic growth and understating inflation, and that is deliberate, and I really find that criminal.
Well, deliberate in the sense that the government always wants to look good. It always wants to paint a rosier scenario than reality might posit.
Well, not just that. If you go back to the 1990s, Alan Greenspan was one who led the charge here. The move was made to restate inflation for purposes of cutting the federal budget deficit. Alan Greenspan's position was simply the CPI, that's a headline number that still is published today on inflation, overstated inflation, and that if only we had a more accurate number, a number with lower inflation, that would reduce government spending in the terms of cost of living adjustments to people on Social Security. It would also increase tax revenues by boosting taxpayers into higher income tax brackets than they were. So he proposed and, along with the Boskin Commission, set up a number of changes to the CPI inflation aimed at reducing CPI. But if you asked him what's wrong with the CPI, how is it overstated, his response would be, well, suppose steak gets very expensive and people buy more hamburger. If they buy more hamburger, their cost of living isn't as great, but that's not reflected in the CPI, so the CPI overstates inflation. Well, what you have to consider here and what you have to understand is the way most people view a cost of living measure and the way, or the various inflation measures have been viewed over time, and I'm talking here centuries. I mean, you have price indices that go back literally centuries. The idea has always been to measure inflation from the standpoint of maintaining a constant standard of living. Prices are rising. What kind of an adjustment do I need to make to my income or to my investment strategy so that I can at least live as well as I did last year? But the changes that were made here, where they introduced substitution effects, or tried to at least, and tried to mimic that in the headline CPI, the effects there were to give you something that was not measuring a constant standard of living. It was effectively measuring a declining standard of living. I mean, if you can go from steak to hamburger, you can go from hamburger to dog food, which unfortunately has happened to some people I know of that have just can't live on the adjustments that they've gotten on their, for example, Social Security. And that was done deliberately to reduce the cost of living adjustments, and that I can't buy. I mean, there have to be better ways to balance the budget than lie to people.
It's absolutely criminal. I think you're correct. But again, when I worked for Dr. Paul, we used to talk about the Fed tax, and Dr. Paul defined that loosely as, let's say, the difference between the real rate of inflation, not CPI, but what we might call the real rate of inflation, and the interest rate one could get on a reasonable, non-esoteric certificate of deposit or simple savings account. And the difference between those two is the Fed tax. If you accept that definition, it seems to me, maybe you have a different view, that the Fed tax is about as high or higher than it's ever been. In other words, the delta between interest rates one can easily earn and what you're really losing in inflation.
Yeah, that's a fair. It's got to be at a record high. It gets worse each year because the changes that have been made here are cumulative, and they were not just changes that were made with Greenspan in the 1990s. They started back in the 1980s, changing the way CPI was calculated and estimated, and the changes there over time have had an aggregate impact of about 5 percentage points that they publish and admit to as changes in methodology. And there's another couple of percentage points on there for changing elements such as going from mom and pop shops downtown to malls out in the highway where people tend to buy cheaper products. And that's, you say, well, that's what I do. Again, this has not been handled in a way that handles things consistently in terms of measuring what would be maintaining a constant standard of living. Now, what they did here, they recognize that there's a problem. You have the government's tip instruments, the treasuries that are adjusted for inflation. And I believe you'll find somewhere in the background of those documents that if they change the methodology, they have to adjust the pre-existing tip instruments. Well, they've been very careful not to have any so-called methodological changes since it would affect that. But a real simple thing, and this was just to give you an idea, and it was more a matter of rounding than anything else. But if you look at the cost of living adjustment that came out of the CPI this last year for adjusting Social Security payments, I believe it was 0.3%. They made a correction to one of their adjusted numbers, and it was just a real small one. You wouldn't see it in most of the aggregate numbers, but the way it worked out, the effect was it knocked the headline adjustment to 0.3% from what would have been 0.4%. Many people rely on the government's numbers. It's not just government elements, but people out in the private sector. Landlords often will have their rental fees escalated by the CPI. They're not getting an even bet. And if you're basing your investment return on trying to beat the government's CPI measure, you're doing yourself a disservice there because you're not keeping up with inflation. I think that would pretty much confirm what you're saying about that Fed tax actually expanding. It continues to year after year.
Well, let's talk a little bit about inflation as it relates to the monetary base and then the broader money supply, one measure of which M3 is no longer compiled by the Fed, but it's compiled by you. Talk to people just generally about, the monetary base has expanded more than 4 times since the crash of 08-09. And a lot of Fed apologists will say, well, gee whiz, that's not the money supply. And as long as that money is sitting there, parked more or less as bank reserves, and it's not sloshing around in the general economy, it saved the banks. It provided them solvency or liquidity. And why should we care if the monetary base is quadrupled? I say we should care, but I'd like to hear what you say.
Well, let me put it this way. The U.S. government has a tremendous solvency problem long-term. Unfunded liabilities, net present value, but with the existing liabilities such as the federal debt in excess of $100 trillion, it can never be covered as things exist. The Fed's quantitative easing, what they did here, was not at all as represented. You go back to 2008, you had the collapsing banking system. The Fed, the Treasury got together. There's a general agreement. Absolute agreement. We will not let the system collapse. Now, the Fed says it has a mandate to keep the economy growing, to contain inflation. Their primary function is to keep the banking system afloat. They had failed. The banking system was collapsing, and we shouldn't have been in that position, but it's a I mean, you have to think real hard as to what you want to do. You let the system go or not. They decided to save the system at all costs. And what they did was there's all sorts of stopgap measures, guaranteed whatever had to be guaranteed. They bought companies, they funded companies like AIG. They did whatever they had to do to keep the banking system afloat. The quantitative easing, initially, you'd think, my goodness, the monetary base was a tool usually used to control either up or lower the growth rate of the money supply. But that involved the monetary base generally going into the flow of commerce with banks lending. Now, had the banks been allowed to lend some of this money, that might have helped the economy some. It would have gone into lending, would have kept commerce going a little better than it did. The problem was the banking system was collapsing, and the Fed, not that they could do much to stimulate the economy, but they didn't even think of it. They were looking at saving the banks. Problem was the public was getting a little uncomfortable with bailing out the banking system, so that whenever the Fed upped its quantitative easing, it was doing so in response to negative economic news. They're doing this to save the economy. That was their political coverage. It did nothing to save the economy. It did help to provide some liquidity to the banking system. But guess what? All these treasuries that they were buying also were effectively monetizing the federal debt. In the period of time where they're actively buying the treasuries, they effectively monetized 75% of the new debt issuance, public debt issuance of the Federal Reserve. Now, that should have been very inflationary, and it will be, because we're coming back to that. That we're not finished with salvaging the banking system here. But when they ceased the quantitative easing, so to speak, they did not liquidate their treasury the treasury holdings. They're still holding $2.5 trillion there in treasuries. The Treasury pays them interest, but the Fed pays the interest back to the Treasury. That's fully monetized. They might as well just write it off. And that's where you get into big trouble down the road with inflation, and it's where I'll tell you how we get there very soon. But the issue there is that if you don't have the ability to pay what you owe, which is the U.S. government does not, you either have to borrow it or you have to print the money. The Treasury has been borrowing. They were having some funding problems. They got downgraded by S&P back in 2011. You started to see some rapid flight from the dollar, and then all sorts of interventions. What happened there, though, with the Fed's intervention, effectively saved the Treasury as well as the banks, because the Fed again was monetizing that debt. Now, if you look at the circumstance today, the rest of the world is pretty much dumping treasuries. They're not buying them. China, Japan, South Korea, former big buyers of treasuries. They're not buying. The Federal Reserve still out there with $2.5 trillion, and they have a banking system that still is not solvent. It hasn't worked globally. We're at a point where there's talk you're going to have an imminent rate increase. It may happen, maybe not. But following that does not preclude further quantitative easing. You have an economy that is never fully recovered from the crash into 2009. It's turning down again. That puts more stress on the banking system. The banking system is still not solvent or fully solvent. Got all sorts of problems there. They're not lending normally. The Fed's going to have to go back in and increase quantitative easing again, buying up the treasuries. I would expect them to do the same thing they did before, effectively monetizing the debt. This is something you'd expect at the end of the cycle when the U.S. couldn't pay off its bills and just release monies and put you into hyperinflation. The monetization there does have a very big inflationary effect and should lead to very bad inflation down the road. Among other things, right now, what's helped contain the circumstance has been all sorts of jawboning. Yes, we're going to raise interest rates, which helps to prop the dollar. And as long as they can prop the dollar and try and bring in some money from abroad, that's one thing. But as they turn back to the quantitative easing, which I think you'll see early in 2017, the dollar will be dumped, and you'll see a tremendous amount of dollars being put back into the system. The Fed's got to absorb. There's going to be quantitative easing. They're going to be buying treasuries, and that will that will affect the money supply, and that will spike the money supply, and it will give us a tremendous inflation problem. In terms of M3, why they stopped doing it, I don't think it was for the reasons why they stopped covering it. I do not believe it was for the reasons they expressed. They said, it's too expensive to track and report, and it didn't give them any new information. Well, so they're reporting M1 and M2. M1 is just basically cash or near cash, like checking accounts. M2 includes savings accounts, small time deposits. M3 takes you into large time deposits, CDs, institutional money funds, Eurodollar accounts. If you follow the small time deposits and money funds, why wouldn't you follow the bigger ones? M2 is something like 60% of M3. And what we've been seeing recently is that we've seen a big pickup in M2 and M1 growth, but it hasn't been happening in M3. What's been happening with them is that you've seen some liquidation in those larger accounts that I still follow. The Fed still has those numbers. It's not that they don't have the numbers. They could put it together if they wanted to. But this growth that you're seeing, which some people consider to be healthy, others say they're worried about inflation, actually is not inflationary as it looks, because it reflects these funds that are generally being liquidated out of M3 into let's say the M2 accounts, so that where the numbers weren't in M2 before, now they are, and it makes M2 look larger. That's all smoke and mirrors. We're not yet at the brink of a real serious inflation with those money supply numbers, but watch this next round of quantitative easing, because as soon as that kicks in, all the other factors that will be negatives from the standpoint of an expanded money supply will be in place. The inflationary pressures will start to mount. The dollar selling will intensify. I look for the dollar as we know it to become effectively worthless. And in the process, if you're an individual, what you need to look at is preserving your wealth and assets. If you live in a dollar-denominated world, gold is the primary hedge there. Silver is as well. Physical gold, physical silver that will preserve the purchasing power of your current assets going forward. And you have a circumstance like that, and all of a sudden you start to see rapid inflation. Gold right now has been hit very heavily, and a lot of that's deliberate intervention by the central banks, selling by the central banks, trying to discourage ownership of it. But when the inflation begins to surface, when the renewed selling of the dollar picks up, you're going to see the inflation fears rise, and along with that, gold prices. But if gold gets up to 10,000, or when it gets to 10,000, or when it gets to 100,000, you don't want to just run and take your profits. Because when you get to that point, what that's telling is you're in the middle of a major inflation problem, one that is going to, as I see it, end up in the complete debasement and devaluation of the dollar. The dollar will become worthless. So that where you buy the gold, the concept there is it's a hedge. This is not, people have loved to do day-to-day trading in it, that's fine. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about having this as a store of wealth, something to protect you against the inflation ahead. You have to hold it through the crisis. If you hold it through the crisis, you will have kept intact and liquid the purchasing power that you had in your assets before the crisis.
Well, it's interesting you talk about what the Fed's doing and more QE possibly in 2017. Does it ever amaze you how they're able to change their tune? It wasn't that long ago, 2011, 2012, where the St. Louis Fed chair, Bullard, was talking about how they were going to unwind all this $2.5 trillion of Treasury debt that they bought. And just a couple months ago, Ben Bernanke at their conference at Jackson Hole in Wyoming said, well, we might have to rethink that and even consider expanding the Fed's balance sheet a little bit. I mean, it's almost like the financial press has amnesia and still imagines that there's a plan of some sort.
Well, the press plays along with this. I mean, the financial press is largely controlled by Wall Street, and the interests there are the same as the Feds. They just want to keep the system as liquid as possible and make as much money off it as possible. But the problem is that it's not good for the average guy, and it sure is not good for the system over the long haul. The system's effectively been bankrupted. We have a new administration coming in, and there's talk of fiscal stimulus. Fiscal stimulus should generate some economic activity. The problem is there's a lead time there, 9 months to a year, before you start seeing it hit the economy. There, of course, is impact on the deficit, depending upon how that's worked, and where there's hope that an expanding economy in the future will generate revenues to bring down the deficit or control the deficit. The problem is the long-term solvency issues of the sovereign solvency issues of the United States. That has to be addressed in the context of whatever stimulus is put in place here. If the long-term solvency issues can be handled, brought into some kind of a credible form of control, then they've got a clear shot for whatever they want to do. But if they don't, you have a circumstance where as the stimulus packages are put in place, there will be, I'd be very surprised if there's not some increase, at least short-term, in the federal deficit. The process there will focus the global markets again on the long-term dollar insolvency. I mean, there's no question, that unless the circumstance is brought under control for the United States, at some point in time, the dollar becomes worthless, which is no way that we can cover the obligations. That circumstance has to be controlled. That's what brought the system near the brink again in 2011. We were at the brink in 2008, but again, everything they did there was stopgap, and very little, if anything, was done to address the underlying issues that brought us in. Nothing was done to turn the economy around. The solvency issues were not addressed, and they did some stuff to address the banking system, but again, the banking system at this point still is not normal. It's not right. Not lending as it should be. That's all part of the crisis. Effectively, the system collapsed in 2008, and the Fed just hasn't figured out how to get around that. They keep promising raising rates, and they've been doing that for the last year since they hiked rates in December of 2015, and now people look at virtual certainty they'll do it again in 2016. I know this is the day or so before that is being recorded, but whether or not they do that, that does not preclude what's going to happen in the next couple of months into 2007 as the economy continues to sink. Seeing that in a lot of good leading indicators to economic activity. Industrial production down year to year for 5 quarters. You've never seen 2 consecutive quarters. We now have 5 consecutive quarters. Never seen 2 consecutive quarters of annual decline in industrial production that's been outside of a formal recession. And that goes back to the founding of the index in the post-World War I era, at the same time and a little bit after the founding of the Fed. You look at help wanted advertising. You don't have the newspaper index the way you used to, but you do have an online advertising index that's surveyed by the Conference Board. And the newspaper index used to be the best leading indicator around. And that went into year-to-year decline, particularly if you're down 10, 15%. You always had a recession. Again, that goes back to post-World War I. We're seeing patterns now in the online index. It's a relatively new index, but it predicted and tracked very closely the economic collapse that began in 2006, 2007 into 2009. And it's been showing a new one in place now. In the near future, you're going to see a lot more in the way of a downturn in the headline data. And that, again, pushes the Fed back into the quantitative easing. They just don't have a way to handle it. It's not a happy circumstance. And if you don't think they're going to work things out, a good place to be is to buy a little bit of insurance, such as with gold.
Well, it's not a happy circumstance, as you say. It's smoke and mirrors, I'm afraid, and we're out of time. But let me just wrap up by saying I wouldn't want to be Janet Yellen right now, and I wouldn't want to be Donald Trump either. Our guest is John Williams. Again, his website is shadowstats.com, all one word, shadowstats.com. Do yourself a favor, check it out. It's an absolutely fascinating site. It has quite a bit of information in front of the paywall that may well entice you to become a paid subscriber. John, I want to thank you for your time, and ladies and gentlemen, you have a great weekend.
Subscribe to Mises Weekends via iTunes U, Stitcher, and SoundCloud, or listen on Mises.org and YouTube.
just changes that were made with Greenspan in the 1990s. They started back in the 1980s changing the way CPI was calculated and estimated. And the changes there over time have had an aggregate impact of about 5 percentage points that they publish and admit to as changes in methodology. And there's another couple of percentage points on there for changing elements such as going from mom and pop shops downtown to malls out in the highway where people tend to buy cheaper products. And that's, you say, well, that's what I do. Again, this has not been handled in a way that handles things consistently in terms of measuring what would be maintaining a constant standard of living. Now, what they did here, they recognize that there's a problem. You have the government's tip instruments, the treasuries that are adjusted for inflation. And I believe you'll find somewhere in the background of those documents that if they change the methodology, they have to adjust the pre-existing tip instruments. Well, they've been very careful not to have any so-called methodological changes since it would affect that. But a real simple thing, and this was just to give you an idea, and it was more a matter of rounding than anything else, but if you look at the cost of living adjustment that came out of the CPI this last year for adjusting Social Security payments, I believe it was 0.3%. They made a correction to one of their adjusted numbers, and it was just a real small one. You wouldn't see it in most of the aggregate numbers, but the way it worked out, the effect was it knocked the headline adjustment and that is deliberate. And I really find that criminal.
Well, deliberate in the sense that the government always wants to look good. It always wants to paint a rosier scenario than reality might posit.
Well, not just that. If you go back to the 1990s, now when Greenspan was the one who led the charge here, the move was made to restate inflation for purposes of cutting the federal budget deficit. Alan Greenspan's position was simply the CPI, that's a headline number that still is published today on inflation, overstated inflation, and that if only we had a more accurate number, a number with lower inflation, that would reduce government spending in the terms of cost of living adjustments to people on Social Security. It would also increase tax revenues by boosting taxpayers into higher income tax brackets than they were. So he proposed, and along with the Boskin Commission, set up a number of changes to the CPI inflation aimed at reducing CPI. But if you asked him what's wrong with the CPI, how is it overstated? His response would be, well, suppose steak gets very expensive and people buy more hamburger. If they buy more hamburger, their cost of living isn't as great, but that's not reflected in the CPI. So the CPI overstates inflation. Well, what you have to consider here and what you have to understand is the way most people view a cost of living measure and the way, or the various inflation measures have been viewed over time. And I'm talking here centuries. I mean, you have price indices that go back literally centuries. The idea has always been 0.3% from what would have been 0.4%. Many people rely on the government's numbers. It's not just government elements, but people out in the private sector. Landlords often will have their rental fees escalated by the CPI. They're not getting an even bet. And if you're basing your investment return on trying to beat the government's CPI measure, you're doing yourself a disservice there because you're not keeping up with inflation. I think that would pretty much confirm what you're saying about that Fed tax actually expanding. It continues to year after year.
Well, let's talk a little bit about inflation as it relates to the monetary base and then the broader money supply, one measure of which M3 is no longer compiled by the Fed, but it's compiled by you. Talk to people just generally about, the monetary base has expanded more than 4 times since the crash of 08, 09. And a lot of Fed apologists will say, well, gee whiz, That's not the money supply. And as long as that money is sitting there, parked more or less as bank reserves, and it's not sloshing around in the general economy, it saved the banks. It provided them solvency or liquidity. And why should we care if the monetary base is quadrupled? I say we should care, but I'd like to hear what you say.
Well, let me put it this way. The U.S. government has a tremendous solvency problem long term, unfunded liabilities, net present value, but with the existing liabilities such as the federal debt in excess of $100 trillion. It can never be covered as things exist. The Fed's quantitative easing, what they did here, was not.
This is Mises Weekends with your host, Jeff Deist.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us once again on Mises Weekends. I'm very pleased to have as our guest today John Williams, who's the proprietor and founder of a very important and a great website called shadowstats.com. It's a site that I've been familiar with since a long time ago, back in my days working for Ron Paul. We used to use John's information and data in some of Dr. Paul's speeches and statements. John holds a couple of degrees from Dartmouth College, and he worked for many years in the private sector for Fortune 500 companies as a consultant and economist for them. But as I mentioned, he now runs shadowstats.com. And if you're not reading it and you're not familiar with him, I think you would do yourself a great favor by reading the site and becoming familiar with him. So with that, John, thanks so much for joining us today.
Jeff, thank you so much for having me.
Well, let me ask you kind of a tongue-in-cheek question before we get into the meat of things. We've been hearing a lot lately about fake news. That seems to be the story of the day. And it struck me when I was looking at your site earlier today. Should we be thinking of government-issued statistics like CPI and GDP as fake, at least in a certain sense of the word?
Absolutely. What you'll see here is that the problems are, in most instances, definitional, where the methodologies have been changed over the years, but the methodologies that have been changed have generally been counterintuitive to what most people expect in the numbers, so that you end up with the headline economic details overstating economic growth and understating inflation. And to measure inflation from the standpoint of maintaining a constant standard of living. Prices are rising. What kind of an adjustment do I need to make to my income or to my investment strategy so that I can at least live as well as I did last year? But the changes that were made here, where they introduced substitution effects, or tried to at least, and tried to mimic that in the headline CPI, the effects there were to give you something that was not measuring a constant standard of living. It's effectively measuring a declining standard of living. I mean, if you can go from steak to hamburger, you can go from hamburger to dog food, which unfortunately has happened to some people I know of that have just can't live on the adjustments that they've gotten on their, for example, Social Security. And that was done deliberately to reduce the cost of living adjustments. And that I can't buy. I mean, there have to be better ways to balance the budget than lie to people.
It's absolutely criminal. I think you're correct. But when I worked for Dr. Paul, we used to talk about the Fed tax, and Dr. Paul defined that loosely as, let's say, the difference between the real rate of inflation, not CPI, but what we might call the real rate of inflation, and the interest rate one could get on a reasonable, non-esoteric certificate of deposit or simple savings account. And the difference between those two is the Fed tax. If you accept that definition, it seems to me, maybe you have a different view, that the Fed tax is about as high or higher than it's ever been. In other words, the delta between interest rates one can easily earn and what you're really losing in inflation.
Yeah, that's a fair. It's got to be at a record high. It gets worse each year because the changes that have been made here are cumulative, and they were not